Hi, Gail.
Hello, how's everyone?
Doing just fine, thanks. And hi, Jeanette. How are you?
Hi. Good. How are you all?
Good. And who is Vivian's iPad?
It's Elaine. I'm here.
Oh, hi, Elaine. Dr. Sponholz is joining us again as well. So I'm hoping that Michael Johnson can join us. Michael was the one that took the photos that we put in the Neatline editor. So someone's mic is on.
That would be me.
Work in the back. So, okay. So, Gail, can we start with you? And you've had a chance to look at the Neatline editor, and I just want you to know that we just finished quite a session with the students talking about their final project and their kind of summative project about what this work has meant to them, and it was just absolutely moving. So I'm so pleased with all their work. To let you know that they took 12 students, entered over 216 individual Omeka entries of the data of the artifacts in the Lifeways exhibit. And so now we have a record of the metadata on 216 of those objects in your Lifeways exhibit that can be used by researchers. And you've taken a look at the Neatline editor. And so I just kind of wanted to turn it over to you about what your overall impressions of their work is and what it means to you and what kind of directions you can kind of see that in the future. And you can unmute your mic now.
Thank you, Dr. Beasley. I want to first say thank you for including the Lincolnville Museum in this project. You don't know how much it means to us. We are excited about the potential for this project. I think that I'm looking forward to when we can have students with some hands-on who could see what's really in the museum. I think Michael did a good job, but the photos that he has are very limited in terms of what's really in the museum, at least what I saw on the Omeka site when I went through it. And so I would like for them to come in, you know, when we're able for everybody to come in and, you know, sort of, some of your students most of them have been through, but I wasn't there at the time because it was on a weekend, to be able to walk through and see what the significance of all those things are that are in the museum. Some of them are props, obviously, but a lot of it is photographs or reproductions of original stories that we have. And what it means to us is the ability to be able to tell our story to people who are not physically able to be in the museum, and then somewhere down the road to be able to have it as a virtual archive for people to look at what they actually meant. Who were the people who helped to build Lincolnville, the people who helped to build, you know, St. Augustine in America, the people who were of African American descent, the contributions that they made, the significance of that, and the background stories on those people. So obviously there's still a lot of work that we all have to do to make sure that we have those stories, and a lot of research that has to be done to make sure that those stories are put in the context of what was happening in the nation and in the world at that time in some cases. But I think this is a great project. You know, we started talking a couple of years ago about this, and now to see it, you know, even if it's just kind of like a skeleton of what we're going to have up where people can actually see it and go to the sites. I found when I was looking through it, there are a couple of sites that I thought were not 100% accurate in terms of the locations and stuff, but there are so many that we can add to it that are part of our exhibits, even just starting, say, with the churches, to be able to go to those actual sites in the community, or to go to what were the home sites of some of the other people in the community that we know about. I love being able to tie the information from the Historical Society about actual addresses and that information. One of the ones we're working on in our museum is on Dr. Roberts. And he lived in a house that one of our current board members is living in today. So we have all that information about him. We have him displayed in the museum. And then we have all the background information about the history of that home on Bridge Street. And we're doing something right now that we're working on in terms of his role in the 1918 pandemic and the victims in St. Augustine. So we are working on that currently, and it's not a Twine photograph, but it's in that same little early Twine era, but this Twine project is helping us to bring all of our exhibit, that we did last year in our Lifeways, that covers not just the Lincolnville stories, because we did include the Crusaders project in there. So there's a lot that precedes or predates Richard Twine, but Richard Twine captured that period in history that a lot of, I think, America can relate to, and put Lincolnville and St. Augustine into into a space where they are equivalent to a Harlem or other cities in our nation at that time, because his photographs will be depictions of what life was like during that time period in our, the early part of the 20th century. And so, yes.
Thank you, Gail. I was wondering any of the students I know the students had lots of questions about many of the different people that they were researching. And so I don't know if we have time to get into those specific questions, but if anybody just has a question for Gail about just the importance of your work, or just to kind of reflect back on your going to the museum the first time to where we're at today, she might appreciate that. So if anybody has a quick comment, or more of a comment than maybe a question, but maybe you could just let her know what this work has meant to you.
The work has definitely been, for me at least personally, a really interesting way of accessing a part of history that I didn't know. I've lived in Florida my entire life, and I've just been in Jacksonville the last few years. So being here as sort of a new resident of Jacksonville, I didn't really understand sort of the history that I was sort of sitting on, essentially. And so sort of working through the Lincolnville archives has really allowed me to access a part of what's really become my personal history in a really new and interesting and exciting way. I think, for me personally, the most interesting history is the one that's closest to you. And so really getting to understand how important and rich and interesting all that history is, and really how the kind of untold stories that are involved with some of these residents is really cool. Like with the Crossing in St. Augustine movie, I had no idea, the extent to which that the civil rights movement is just a period was played out, and just St. Augustine is a small part of Florida, and getting to see just that microscopic view of such a larger narrative was really cool, to try to sort of fit certain pieces together and really see how Lincolnville as a community really reflect other periods of time throughout the states, and I thought that was a really cool interrelation between the two.
Thank you, Andrew. And Gail, you should know that Andrew clocked in over 50 different Omeka entries. Andrew was in charge of all of the jazz and the music entries. And so all of the jazz and the music entries are Andrew's. So thank you, Andrew, for your contribution to the collection. Anyone else?
I definitely can say that it instilled a lot of pride in me. I think as a woman of color, you don't always see representation of your past, present, or future, especially from the world's perspective. So seeing so many iterations of Black life and seeing so many different perspectives and representations of what it meant to be Black beauty through some of Richard Twine's photos, and Black just philanthropy through some of the civil rights museum or items. It just gave me a lot of pride and courage, and reminded me that this is not just something of the past, that, you know, I'm continuing something that people started before me for me. And I also really loved some of the very static aspects of the museum that allowed me to just kind of rest in moments. So I love the parlor room. I love the church room, where there was just as much room to kind of rest in a moment and experience a moment and relate it to your memories. Like, I immediately thought of my grandmother when I went to the parlor room and her sitting room, and those experiences were so unexpected. And it reminded me that, you know, I can create more of those memories, that what we're experiencing right now is going to be an archive soon. So that was really great for me.
And Miss Gail, my name's Dee. I'm thankful for you all trusting us enough to grant us access. I was talking to my course mates and Dr. Beasley about my final project and how access and authority were the themes and the topics. And one of the things I mentioned is that the community of Lincolnville, members of Lincolnville, really took ownership of their story, of their narrative in this project, and then to be a part of as you said, expanding or giving greater exposure and putting it on equal footing as something like a Harlem or a La Villa. I felt empowered to do that, and so I appreciate being granted the access.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And that's something that we really wanted to do when we started that project, because it's so easy to get lost in the national narrative. And so I fought hard, and Elaine can tell you that, Dr. Spano, she's online, how hard I fought for that, because I wanted it to be a local Lincolnville story, not just get lost in the shuffle of the greater narrative that, you know, you can get anywhere.
Thank you, Gail. So Elaine, we can bring you in here a little bit and tell us a little bit about, you've been able to take a look at the links and the neat line map, and tell us a little bit about what the students' work means for you.
Well, it just adds a lot of context and nuance to what we were working on. I mean, Gail and I were working under a terrible amount of time pressure, and you all have had the luxury, you know, from my point of view, because I like research, to really sit down and dig deep and find all these connections. Like, I just saw that Mrs. Mason Larkins was part of Twine's theatrical group, which I didn't know when we were working on this. And I didn't realize that he lived at 62 Washington Street. I would have gone by there just to look at the lot, you know, to imagine that house. But that's what Gail and I were trying to do the whole time, is sort of trigger people's imagination to bring the kind of dusty photographs that, you know, a lot of times young people don't think it really relates to them, but they're really the inheritors of the situations that all those people brought about, for the good and for the bad, you know, so that they can go forward and understand their history. And, you know, Florida gets left out a lot of times. This tale is always seems like Florida story is told by people that aren't from Florida most of the time, and much less people of color. So, you know, part of this impetus for this exhibit was to right some of those wrongs, you know, to kind of bring the, like Gail was reminding, you know, always reminding us to make it specific to the location, to not let it get homogenized into the national narrative, because the national narrative isn't actually accurate because of who told it in the past and who had the right to be published and who had the right to make up the textbooks. So I think you're doing really good work. I think it's, you know, adding to what we started, and that's always, you know, like a great feeling to see if you start something off and people pick it up. It's like a race. So we're happy about that.
Thank you, Elaine.
Do that.
Do the students, are there any comments or questions from students for Elaine?
I'm kind of curious because I guess I had seen it differently than how you and Gail have sort of seen the museum. I sort of saw it as a reflection of a larger narrative, and maybe that was sort of a misunderstanding of the attempts of the museum. But I'm sort of curious how you see sort of like certain leadership figures, because I noticed in one particular part of the museum that comes to mind, there is some focus on sports athletes, and usually culturally sports athletes are very large, very public figures, and sometimes on a very national scale. And I'm sort of curious how you sort of settle this notion of Lincolnville as being a very community-based, very grassroots type of community and museum, and sort of how you see it in contrast to sort of how it fits in a larger narrative. How do you sort of separate the two when you have figures like Dr. King coming in, or you have maybe certain athletes that maybe come to prominence, you know, at a national scale, and they sort of become hometown heroes? You know, how do you sort of keep the two separate when they do kind of tend to overlap?
I think my intent was not to just be a reflection of the national narrative, but to be a unique part of that narrative, in the sense that here's a small community, Lincolnville, that most people have never heard of on a national level, in a community of St. Augustine, where you have 450 plus years of African American history, which is a part of our overall mission to tell those stories, not just, you know, a tight timeline, but a narrative that supersedes a lot of the national narrative, because the history predates a lot of the national history. We have a project that's coming online, hopefully in the near future, that will highlight more of that we're doing. And so it will tell some of those earlier stories about the early settlers who happen to have been of African descent. But the whole point of doing the Lincolnville Lifeways storyline was to tell, these are people who had the same time periods in terms of the national narrative that was going on, but they had limited resources, in a sense that it's a smaller community, so there were fewer of them. But in spite of all of that, that they were able to take that and build a community that created individuals, say like the Gallimore, who was a sports figure who, you know, made it to the Hall of Fame, and take that, or, you know, the attraction of other national sports figure or national figure like Dr. King, that you took a small community that, because of its ideal of excellence and wanting to be included in the larger narrative, that they were able to attract national attention to what they were doing.
Thank you, Gail.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Did you want to comment on that, Elaine, at all, or?
Well, I think things can not necessarily have to be one way or the other, especially with stories. They can run on different levels at the same time. And it also brought to my mind the idea that in the past that, you know, certain people belong in the public spotlight and the public sphere, as academics call it, and certain people don't. And in the past, that included people of color and women. And, you know, this is showing how, like, you seem to be focused on the sports figures, which I don't know as much about. I didn't happen to do that graphic, but, you know, I think that's one of the more tightly specific part of the display, is that didn't all of those sports figures that came to national prominence come out of Lincolnville? We wouldn't have just picked, you know, sort of like a random sports figure, right?
Right.
And then, you know, I think of Ray Charles. I mean, he earned his way into the national spotlight, but like other, you know, African American musicians, there was a price to pay for that. So, you know, it's I guess it's looking at how celebrity works in a country that has struggled with and failed in many ways to address its racism, you know, and to see that people were talented and multifaceted and, you know, were able to rise above the hurdles that they had to rise above. So does that answer your question?
No, it absolutely does. I mean, I guess for me, it's just hard to sort of separate the two in some sense, because they are interrelated. But I do really appreciate the focus that you guys have presented on really focusing really hard on those very specific narratives, because I think it can be easy to get lost, as you have said, in sort of that larger scheme of things, and sort of really focus it and really narrow it down. I think really is really important to the point that you raised of making it focused on diversity and those voices that do get lost in the sort of the echo and the sort of the crowd, so to speak. So no, it absolutely sort of helps. Yeah, helps me.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd like to bring Jeanette into the conversation now. Jeanette is, I introduced you a little bit to the class before you came on. Jeanette Vigalotti is a graduate, an alum of UNF's MA program and the Rhetoric and Composition concentration. And she's a PhD candidate at Virginia Commonwealth University. And she is also, and has been, the social media director for the St. Augustine Historical Society. So Jeanette, please talk to us a little bit about what the work the students has done means to you and the Historical Society.
All right. I have really just enjoyed the last, I guess, like little bit of time listening to the conversation. And then I was able to take a look at the Omeka Neatline site. So something that keeps coming up is this idea of like what it means to tell like localized stories and localized histories. And I'm reminded of this line in a book called Emergent Strategy about small is all. And I think that one of the powerful things that's happening on this digital visual archive is that we're able to see and understand relationships quite differently, especially of a space like St. Augustine that is narrated in very particular familiar ways, the story of colonization. And this adds another dynamic to understand what it means to be in St. Augustine. And there are very particular localized incarnations of what it means to be a person in this town for, as Gail said, 450 years, and how different that can look once we are able to collaborate across institutions, which I think is something Dr. Beasley is really great at, creating opportunities for cross institutional collaboration, where you take the holdings from the St. Augustine Historical Society and you're able to connect to the Lincolnville Museum, and suddenly you can tell a very different story because you have access to totally different materials. So I think I know that you've worked with Chad on and off throughout the semester, and I think that what it means for the St. Augustine Historical Society is that there are ways, and very viable ways, to continue telling more collaborative histories. And that's extremely exciting because it seems like still kind of uncharted territory for our town, and certainly for the Historical Society. So I feel very excited by the work that you're doing, knowing that researchers in the future are going to actually be able to ask better questions because there is a visualization of relationships in a completely different way from before that Neatline site went live. And that is something that's really thrilling. I think Elaine said, I think it was Elaine, I was trying to jot down notes and it got a little crazy. But something Elaine said about, like, if you start work and then people are able to build from it, then that's a really gratifying feeling. So I'm excited to see the ways that we continue to build knowledge from this perspective, from the Black life perspective in St. Augustine, and have that more prominent and more accessible, which is really the most important thing.
Thanks, Jeanette. Do any students have any questions for Jeanette? About the work of the St. Augustine Historical Society and Chad and the Neatline project. What are you able to do with some of the work that we've done for social media in St. Augustine, Jeanette?
So something that I am excited to continue to do and feature more prominently is the work that you all are doing. We just recently redesigned our website, and one of the priorities for me in that redesign was having a section for community collections and work that's going on. So that way we can highlight moments like this and then disseminate that message across our social media platforms. So it doesn't always have to feel like social media is just an advertisement for, like, come visit the oldest house, which is how one of the ways that we get funding through our tours, but using social media to leverage projects like this that are happening so we can increase awareness.
What does it mean to you as a digital humanities scholar, Jeanette? How do you see what we've done fitting into the kind of scholarship on where digital humanities is at right now? Because we've talked a little bit about that, and a number of the students have talked about utilizing DH and using access for action in a lot of different contexts. But you're a digital humanities scholar. What and maybe Elaine could address this too. Like, where do you see what we're doing in relationship to DH scholarship?
Do you want me to start or Elaine?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeanette.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I see what is happening as extremely important and vital, and I think vital is actually the right word here, because I don't think that we can, as someone just emerging into this field, one of the boons I see to digital humanities scholarship is the ability to push against and push past silos. We can do so much more together than we can separately, and seeing all of the entries and people take ownership of different areas of scholarly inquiry, you have all of those minds working on a problem and that space. And I think that what really resonates for me with the work that's happening is just the ability to visualize it differently, to see those connections. Someone said earlier, talking about triggering the imagination, and then trying to continue something that people started before you, resting in the moment. And I think that a site like this, Neatline, allows you to, or allows people to start asking questions, and better questions about the space that they're in.
Oh, interesting. Elaine, I'll throw it over to you, and then I'm going to come back to Gail for the last word. So,
Well, you know, I've done a lot of digital humanities projects, and I come from a background of doing quite a few oral history interviews. And what's at the forefront of my mind right now is, as we're in this, you know, the and you know, we won't hear.
We're losing you there, Eileen.
And can you hear me? Hello?
Now I can hear you better, yes.
Okay. Shall I say that again?
Yes, please.
I said, as we're in the middle of this pandemic, what's, you know, on the forefront of my mind is how many stories that will be lost if they're not recorded or somehow put in digital form. You know, that extends to the history of Lincolnville, where we have living memory of who was at that press conference with Martin Luther King that hasn't been completely documented, of who was in the photograph that we, you know, put into that room. And, you know, that extends to like everybody's lived experience of right now, the people that are struggling against gentrification and Lincolnville and everything else. You know, people know a lot that they walk around with in their heads, but you know, I found that now asking some questions about my family and what happened when my family and my father survived the pandemic in 1918 has put some things together for me that I never realized. I didn't realize that from damage that happened important, put it into the
We've
form
lost.
of a digital, because so it's important. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
It's important, you know, to put it into digital media because that will survive in one form or the other. We may not play it in the future the same way, but at least we're able to document our grandparents and great grandparents and everything we can get down into something like the Omeka site, or film or audio or whatever we can do to save those memories.
Thank you, Eileen. I'm going to turn it over to Gail for any last thoughts. This has been one of the things that you and I have been working on, is kind of this partnership where we're changing the way that education works. For me, this is the most important part of what our class is doing, because what we're able to do is have this partnership with your intern program. So we're able to put an intern to work with you, and after a semester, that intern is able to produce a body of work. So this last year, we did the Twine work, and out of that Twine work, Michael Johnson did an internship, and out of that internship, he produced the contents of the Lifeways exhibit, and the contents of that Lifeways exhibit became the actual course material for the next iteration of that particular class. So students, what Gail is looking for is another intern to work with her, and the work that you produce as an intern will become the course material for the next iteration of this particular class, the way that Emma Lynn is working on right now. So
right, and it's a delicate balance, because, you know, one, we want to make our work known. We want to be an archive, and there's no better way to do that than to be a digital archive in today's world. You know, we have hurricanes. This has become more, I think, more. We've become more focused on it as we've been home with the COVID-19 shutdown, that if we don't have ways to share our stories with people who don't have the ability to go out and walk into a museum, then we really are dead in the water. At the same time, we want to be able to have a museum because people coming into a museum is a stream of revenue. As a museum operator, trust me, I know, because we're dead in the water. But we want to be able to tell our stories in a way that will entice people to want to come in and see more, or scholars to want to say, hey, let me go over there. Maybe they have some information that we can't find other places. Now, at this point, because we're a relatively young museum, you know, we don't have the archives of the government house here locally, or the University of Florida, or the Historical Society, but we have access to those. And what we've always intended to do was to be kind of like a clearinghouse for all things African American in St. Augustine. So we're able to utilize those archives and bring that information, much of it that's already in the public domain, into a space that we can say, hey, you can come here and you can do a paper about what happened in the St. Augustine Renaissance of the 1920s, because that's what Lincolnville represents, a local Harlem Renaissance, so to speak. You can come here and find out who were the type of people who were in business here when the country was handed over from the Spanish to the English. You can get all that kind of information eventually. We are not there. We're a long ways from there, but the work that you're doing is helping us to get there. That we'll be able to highlight individual people in our collection. Say, one of my favorite people in the museum is our Satiki story. That story is very rarely known in St. Augustine and other places. The photo that we have in our museum came from the Library of Congress. So it's not like it's not documented somewhere, but if you don't pull all that information together, then people won't know that it's a St. Augustine story. He did have a New York connection because of Buckingham Smith. Most people never heard of who was Buckingham Smith. So those are the kinds of things that this Omeka project will be able to help us to do, so that as you do the mapping, that you can look at all the different ways that you know, this one little person affected history in our country. I would like to see some timelines included in there eventually, so that we know that this was the time period that this happened, that we know that Satiki was Jack Smith. People don't know who that is, but they'll know that he had a church on King Street, which is now pretty much where the not Casa Monica, but the museum, the Leitner Museum, is in that spot. So those are kind of stories that we can go and connect, that will make this history relevant to what people see when they come back to St. Augustine, whenever that is, or if they never come to St. Augustine and they want to know about the history of St. Augustine from an African American perspective, they will know some of those characters in our history that help to make it the city that it is today. And I think this is a great project.
Thank you, Gail. And thank you everyone for joining us, to Jeanette and to also Elaine for joining us.